Welcome back to my series of Olympic talks taking place on Olympic Day 2020, where I talk about an Olympic Games through the clothing that I own that I've brought back from that Olympic Games. And as you probably have guessed already, this is China, and it is the Beijing 2008 Olympic Games, a absolutely remarkable Olympic Games for me. And not just because I got to know and discover China. I went to Beijing 2 years before the Games, spent a month there researching the local politics, the culture, trying to understand China, which is an enormous task. Certainly can't be done in 1 month, even living there full time. It's just impossible. But still, you get something from every visit. And I learned so much in that month that helped me conduct the work I did in 2008, which of course was surrounded by international controversy. The Olympic Games were the attention for many other issues that China was going through at the time, not least of which was this kind of economic revolution. The narrative on China was its emerging rise to being an international superpower, but in the context of a very controversial failure to attend to human rights issues, which organizations like Human Rights Watch and Reporters Without Borders were really focused on telling the public about. In fact, my hidden item of clothing is a item that was created out of one of these campaigns. And as you can see, it sort of conveys the idea that the Olympic Games are in some respects allowing a nation to really celebrate something that it shouldn't be proud of, which was its record on giving very limited rights to journalists to cover what was happening in the country. So the international media community was very much conflicted about these games. On the one hand, for a reporter, China has been an enormous story for many, many years, and there was some remarkable international coverage about China in the months and years leading up to the Beijing Games. I think in many respects, the way I look at these matters and think about them is less focused on whether in fact a nation should have the privilege to host the Games if it has a track record in things like human rights that we feel are far lacking in what they should be, and more around the idea that by bringing the Olympic Games to a nation, it shines a light on issues that then can be addressed, hopefully for the better going forwards. Now, that's not always the case, and it doesn't always happen. In fact, with the Beijing Games, it was a really interesting situation where, because of the limitations on media freedoms, it required new legislation to be brought in to allow the reporters from all over the world to actually do their work. Because when you enter into China, you enter into the kind of restrictions on media freedom that exist around them. So the Olympic Games bubble became this place in which you had a kind of temporary expansion of media freedom to report what's happening in China that ideally we thought this could open up and China would change. It would become a different place for journalists. But in fact, that lockdown occurred again after the Games finished. So I'm not sure that it was a Games that changed very much in terms of either media freedom or attention to human rights. But it was certainly a Games that shone a light on these issues and created a global conversation about them. A conversation that was felt from even before the Games began, where with the international leg of the Olympic torch relay, when it went from place to place, there was protest after protest. And I think, again, it sort of reminds us that the Olympic Games can be a vehicle for drawing attention to controversial issues. It doesn't necessarily want that attention because, of course, what Olympic organisers want is really for the Olympic Games to happen without any upset, especially to the host nation. It's kind of like going to somebody's house for dinner and complaining about the food. So it doesn't sit well with the Olympic hosts or the organisers or the Olympic Committee that this happens. But I think as an academic, as a researcher, as someone that's interested in social change, I think if you take a step back and look at it as a whole, it's positive that this becomes a point of conversation. It's positive that we are made more aware of what's happening in a country, even if we discover things we don't like. And that aspect of what the Olympic Games brings to opening up conversations is, again, for me, a fundamental part of its value. It's because it shines a light on these injustices that it matters. It may not be able to resolve them, and I think in many respects it can also exacerbate inequalities. But again, it creates a conversation for a city, for a region, for a nation to think about these matters, to talk about them publicly, and to hopefully find some way of resolving them. Beijing is a remarkable legacy, not least because we've seen at least one games taking place already since then, the Nanjing 2014 Youth Olympic Games, and we're going to see also in 2022 the Winter Games take place. So here we have one nation, one city, claiming so much of Olympic history in such a short space of time that it really signifies, I think, this kind of rise of China in the global scene, where it's become this enormous power that's dictating so much of what happens across the world. And that, again, from a historical perspective, is its value. It's recognizing that the Olympic Games tells us about human history. It tells us about global change. And we can use the Olympic Games as a way of thinking about, of understanding, and making sense of these global conversations. And that's why it matters. That's why the Olympic Games matters, because it gives us an appreciation for history. Speak to you soon.